Awesome. Well, good evening, everybody, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, Tarek, and thank all of you for coming out. The reason I was invited here tonight is threefold. The first is to share with you some of the things that, looking back, I see helped me to become more involved, more active in Bitcoin development, cryptocurrency development. The second thing is to communicate some technical knowledge about cryptocurrency. I'm going to be discussing scaling Bitcoin Cash using SPV technology, and we'll talk about that in the second half of my talk. And lastly, to brainstorm some opportunities for new developers to get involved in the Bitcoin Cash ecosystem. So it feels a little bit odd for me to be talking about this point because it doesn't seem like very long ago at all that I knew absolutely nothing about Bitcoin. I got involved in March of 2013. And one thing I can tell you right away is that the Bitcoin space moves extremely quickly. There's so many opportunities that you're only really constrained by the work that you're willing to put in. Anything is possible right now. So looking back to where I was in 2013, I remember reading comments by people like Gavin Anderson or Greg Maxwell, and I would think, wow, these guys know so much and they're so smart. And at the time I felt like I knew so little, and I was worried. I'm like, will I ever be able to really contribute technically to Bitcoin or cryptocurrency development? And I remember for the entire first year, I was actually scared to post comments in the technical development section at Bitcoin Talk because I was worried that I might say something foolish in front of these, all these brilliant developers. So if anybody is at the stage right now that I was in 2013, what worked well for me was to read, and to read a lot. And there's so much great content available online that you can really teach yourself almost any aspect of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. I mean, there's a lot of garbage too, but there's some really good stuff. So some of the people that helped me were reading Satoshi Nakamoto's work, Gavin Anderson, Greg Maxwell, Mike Hearn, and Death and Taxes. But reading will only take you so far. To really improve your expertise in Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, at a certain point you got to get your hands dirty and mess with the real life technical details. So my second suggestion would be to finish a project. It doesn't really matter what that project is, as long as it's something that you're interested in, and you take it to the point where you've actually built something tangible that works. So as an example, what this was for me was this little air-gapped Bitcoin hardware wallet that I called SigSafe. And SigSafe would co-sign transactions over NFC and then relay the transaction back to the Bitcoin wallet or to the computer to broadcasting to the network. So I did this project purely as an excuse to learn more about the mechanics of Bitcoin transactions at the bit and byte level. But in going through the design process, designing the circuit board, writing the firmware that runs on this little microcontroller here, that will inspect the Bitcoin transaction and figure out what all the different fields mean, and then produce an ECDSA signature if the security conditions that are programmed into it are met. Doing all that and then eventually seeing that transaction confirmed on the Bitcoin network, like a transaction that my custom hardware signed, is, that taught me so much more than I could ever gain just by reading. So finish a project. And that is great for learning, but I think to take full advantage of the work that you might put into a project to really teach you, you should share some of those results somehow. And this leads to my second suggestion, and or my third suggestion, which is to publish quality content. So an example for how this came to be for me is with that SigSafe project. I wrote a white paper, I was keeping track of all my progress in a thread on Bitcoin Talk. And when I had the system debugged and working, I made a little video that explained it and demonstrated it live, signed transactions over NFC, sent it to the network. And then I just put it out there for people to give me feedback. And I'm really glad I did that because what I learned is that there's just so many people out there with so much dollars, and they're just looking always for new projects or new company opportunities. It really blew me away. I think within 48 hours of getting some information out there, I had received 28 emails from different people. Some from reporters, some from venture capital firms, a few big ones like Coastal Ventures, for instance, and it was really neat and kind of a little bit overwhelming because suddenly you're on the phone talking to these people and they're treating you as though you're some kind of Bitcoin guru, and I'm thinking to myself, heck, I just learned all this stuff like 3 months ago. So things move really quickly. So where this idea of publishing quality content took me, I'm really more of a scientist than a programmer or developer, is I continued to write articles about the topics that I was investigating. I would continue to do research experiments, and I started giving more presentations at technical conferences and meetups like this. So what publishing quality content looks like to someone who's more interested in pure development or pure programming might be a bit different. But the point, I don't think the media really matters. The point is just to create things of value and put them out there for the world to see. So for programmers, that might be GitHub. For hardware guys, it might be technical designs. Just put it out there. And this is so important because it helps you obtain critical feedback that you won't otherwise get, that helps you to continue to grow. But it also builds your brand as a developer, which is quite important in the cryptocurrency space, more so than I think in the normal tech world. And lastly, it helps you make important social connections that lead to your next project or your next job. Okay. So on that note, this brings up the fourth suggestion I would have on the topic of what helped me become more involved in Bitcoin development, and that's to join a team. And it can be any team. It might be an open source project, it might be a private project, it might be a paid employment, you're working with your coworkers, it might be volunteer work on some project, it doesn't really matter, but just something that you're doing what you want to be doing. So for me, that was Bitcoin Unlimited, which we founded in 2015 with a bunch of other like-minded people who wanted to create an alternative client to Bitcoin Core that would allow Bitcoin to grow as Satoshi originally designed, which was with bigger and bigger blocks and with users using SPV wallets. So we got Bitcoin Unlimited running, and things took off really well, and we attracted a bunch more developers. And a guy named Peter Schipper, he created this thing called extreme thin blocks. Is there a question?
SPV, what does it mean?
I'm going to talk about that later, but it means simplified payment verification. So it's I think it's section 7 of the white paper, and it's basically the intended design for Bitcoin to scale to billions of users. Okay, so Bitcoin Unlimited was the first client to get these thin blocks working, and this was a really great thing for us. So I took what I had learned from SigSafe about the importance of publishing quality content, and I got the other developers to agree to work towards this, to run this experiment where we would measure block propagation times for these extreme thin blocks, and then block propagation times for standard blocks like produced by the Bitcoin Core client, and document the improvements we were making. And block propagation is very important if you want to scale the network, because bigger blocks are more likely to be orphaned. It's harder to send lots of transactions through the network if the blocks are propagating slowly. So improving the block propagation time is very important. So we spent months doing this experiment. We refined the extreme thin block code, made a bunch of improvements, collected a bunch of data, and then we released our results in a 5-part article series There was a really big moment for Bitcoin Unlimited because it sort of put the project on the map as a serious initiative. And at the end of each of those articles that I would write, I included a QR code that allowed people to donate some money to the Bitcoin Unlimited cause. We had like $2,000 in our fund at the time. And I remember really well, one of my coworkers, he PM'd me and he says, Peter, you should check out the Bitcoin Unlimited multi-sig wallet. Someone made a generous donation. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe it's like $1,000 or something. So I open it up and I'm like, someone sent us $500,000. So it was amazing, like just $500,000 in Bitcoin sitting there. And we learned later that, they were inspired by what we were doing because they wanted to see Bitcoin scale with bigger blocks and users running SPV wallets as well. So they wanted to help fund that initiative. Okay, so from there, the big block movement continued to grow, and eventually that culminated in the Bitcoin Cash fork on August 1st of 2017, which takes us to where we are today. So the reason I'm telling you all this is because I wanted to, to show you, the path that I went through from going from someone who knew nothing about cryptocurrency to becoming someone who's quite involved in cryptocurrency, and the things I learned along the way that I thought might be useful if you're trying to make a similar journey. So if there's one thing I'd like you to take away is that opportunities will present themselves when you work for them. You just got to get out there and do stuff. In a way, I think being a Bitcoin developer or scientist is sort of like Bitcoin mining. You got to keep hashing away at your ideas, and eventually you're going to find that magic nonce value that solves the proof of work problem, and you're going to get a block reward. Okay, so that's like the first half of my talk. The next part, we're getting into technical stuff. So maybe that's a good time for some questions.
So Bitcoin Unlimited, right now, do you guys create a Bitcoin client, or do you guys create like Bitcoin Cash client? What do you guys?
Right now, we maintain a Bitcoin Cash and a Bitcoin Core client. However, I would say 99% of the Bitcoin Unlimited membership is no longer interested really in the BTC side. So I would say all the innovation is happening on the Bitcoin Cash side. And the reason for that is simple, because on the BTC side, they have the 1 megabyte limit. It seems that it's not going to change. And our vision is bigger blocks and SPV wallets. So that's where we put our effort.
There are other developers in the Bitcoin Cash community creating clients, or only?
Oh yes, absolutely. So there's 3 main clients. Those are Bitcoin Unlimited, Bitcoin ABC, and Bitcoin XT. And in fact, one of the Bitcoin XT developers, Tom Harding, he's from San Francisco. He'd probably be a great guy to come in and give a talk. Yeah.
What was your background before you started?
So I guess I'm kind of half engineer and half physicist. So I have a bachelor's degree in engineering physics and a PhD from the Department of Physics and Astronomy. And I work in the technical sector. I do some programming, I do some circuit design, but I also do like more on the physics researchy side. So I kind of straddle, theory and practice.
Are you still doing that, or are you?
I'm slowly inching more and more to being full-time Bitcoin. So I maybe 3 years before I discovered Bitcoin, I started my own company with a partner of mine. And you put a lot of passion into starting your own company, and it's done quite well. But I just want to keep going, and we're growing, but slowly I'm trying to make a transition to full-time Bitcoin.
So Bitcoin Unlimited is not another blockchain?
No. No, yeah, a lot of people get that confused. So prior to the blockchain split on August 1st, where Bitcoin Cash was created, Bitcoin Unlimited was just another client that would operate on the BTC blockchain. So you could download, like miners are running it. At one point last year, about 45% of the network hash power was running the Bitcoin Unlimited client, when it looked like BTC might increase its block size limit. So it's just another version of the client software. Yeah.
So it's the client software that implements the actual protocol?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Bitcoin Unlimited's wallet is open source?
Yeah. Yeah, so Bitcoin Unlimited it's a fork of Bitcoin Core. So it was forked, I guess it would have been sometime in late 2015, and then it's kind of slowly turned into its own creature from there.
Anyone who wants to be involved in Bitcoin Cash needs to be working on one of these wallets? Is that how it works? No, not the wallet, the client.
What do you mean by working on Bitcoin Cash?
Well, like Bitcoin Cash is the client software, right? Essentially.
Well, the client software is what the miners need to run in order to mine blocks and validate transactions. But if you're a developer, like there's so much development work that can be done without even touching Bitcoin, the client itself. Like SPV wallets don't even have to, they're very separate from Bitcoin Unlimited or Bitcoin ABC.
And the protocol development itself of Bitcoin Cash happens in a similar way like Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's very similar to BTC. There's a mailing list you can join. You can get that information from me after the talk, or it's probably pretty easy to find on Google. And most of the discussions now happen on Slack channels and on Telegram channels, which is kind of too bad because in 2013 most of the discussion was very public, but now you kind of got to get invited to the right channels. But yes, it's very, very, very similar. I guess the biggest difference is on BTC there's one main client, and it's Bitcoin Core. So what Bitcoin Core says goes. Bitcoin Cash had the idea that governance would be better if there were, competing clients that are always, competing to get more users running their nodes, to competing to get more of the hash power running their nodes. So right now, Bitcoin ABC has the most amount of hash power, Bitcoin Unlimited is second, and Bitcoin XT is third. But, I view that kind of as something that balances the power in the development politics. So that would be the big difference. Yeah.
How did you decide governance of Bitcoin Unlimited itself?
I didn't really have too much to do with it. So do you know much about Bitcoin Unlimited? Okay, so Bitcoin Unlimited is very different than most open source projects. Most open source projects have like a benevolent dictator model. But Bitcoin Unlimited, we didn't want to do that based on what happened with Bitcoin Core. A lot of people that started Bitcoin Unlimited were frustrated that we couldn't increase the block size even though it seemed like most people wanted to. So Bitcoin Unlimited has like this Articles of Federation which kind of describe how it's going to be governed. So basically if there's some controversial decision, it gets settled by members voting, and they do this using this like cryptographic technique, and we have this cool website for members only where they can submit their votes and cryptographically verify them. And so some people don't like that. They say, oh, that's development by democracy, but that's only what gets introduced into the Bitcoin Unlimited client. So that doesn't affect Bitcoin Cash unless the other developers also do it and the hash power supports it. So that's our development model. Cool. So now let's get on to some technical content. So Bitcoin's original design was as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. The idea is that users should be able to be their own banks and verify their own transactions and send payments to any other user anywhere in the world without having to go through some trusted intermediary who's going to take a big fee or possibly censor the transaction. So the design of Bitcoin was always about low fees, fast transaction, and reliable confirmation. And the design that Satoshi created in 2008 was to grow Bitcoin with bigger blocks and with users that could eventually be numbered in the billions running what are called SPV wallets. And SPV stands for Simplified Payment Verification. And I think this is in section 7 of the Bitcoin white paper where Satoshi describes it. But it's basically, in my opinion, it's a very brilliant solution to the scaling problem because it allows Bitcoin to continue to grow without ever really putting a significant load on the users that are transacting in Bitcoin. But to appreciate how SPV facilitates scaling to billions of users, we need to understand 3 important aspects of Bitcoin's design. So the first is how miners build the proof of work chain, or the chain of block headers, which the network uses as a sort of dispute resolution system for deciding which transaction is valid in a case where someone tries to commit fraud by spending a transaction twice. We need to understand how Bitcoin owners transfer coins, the mechanics behind Bitcoin transactions, and we need to understand the relationship between those coin transfers and the proof of work chain built by the miners. Okay, so the concept of proof of work is described in section 4 of the white paper, and if you haven't read it, do. It's a really nice paper and explanation. And in this talk, we're going to be focusing on proof of work in the context of SPV wallets, and to do so, I have 2 of the recent block headers in that proof of work chain shown here. So, sorry. Does anyone know how big a block header is? You saw it, you probably do. 80 bytes, very good. Okay, there's 3 critical pieces of information in the Bitcoin block header, or at least 3 pieces of information that Satoshi described in the white paper. Anyone can call out 1, 2, or 3 of those?
Hash of the previous block.
Good, the hash of the previous block, yeah. Any? A nonce, great.
The hash and the contents of that.
Good, the hash of the contents. So previous hash, nonce, and root hash. Okay. So for those of you who that makes 0 sense to understand, let's pretend we're a miner and we want to fill in those same boxes in this new block header. So this is the block header that we're trying to mine. Okay, so the first thing we do is we hash that previous block header. We might get a number like 000A453. It's always going to start with a bunch of leading zeros, and we'll see why in a second. And then we take that number, and we write it into the previous hash block. To fill in the root hash, we need to collect all the transactions that we've recently learned about that we want to confirm in the block we're working on. And the critical rule here is that none of those transactions can spend Bitcoins that were spent in one of the previous blocks. That the biggest job of a miner is to prevent double spending. So what the miner does is he collects all those transactions, and then he sort of takes like a digital fingerprint of all that data, that's called the root hash, and then he looks for a magic nonce value that solves the Bitcoin mining puzzle. So with the miner, he's just going to start with the number 0. And then what he does is he hashes that block header, and he might get a number like 4982A3F8. That did not solve the Bitcoin mining puzzle. So then he sticks a 1 in for his nonce, and he gets some other hash here. Did not solve the Bitcoin mining puzzle. He sticks a 2 in, still doesn't solve it. So what's he looking for? What's he trying to do? Great, he's trying to find some nonce that results in a hash with a bunch of leading zeros. In this example, it's 4 leading zeros, and he might not find it until he tries number 45,873. In real Bitcoin, the numbers are vastly bigger than that, and the number of zeros is way more, but you get the idea. Okay, so once he finds a solution, then he publishes that block header along with the block contents. If the other miners agree that that's a good block, there's no double spends, the transactions are valid, then they will repeat that process by building on top of his block header. So that's how the miners build this proof of work blockchain. So an important question is, are there scaling challenges with respect to following that proof of work chain? And it's an important question because it's not only the miners that need to be able to follow that proof of work chain, it's all of the users too. So all those billion people that we would like to eventually see using Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash, if they're running SPV wallets, they need to be able to follow that proof of work blockchain. And the critical thing to note is that all of the transactions sit outside of the proof of work chain. There's no need to download all of the world's transactions in order to follow along. And this is something that I don't think is really well understood, but it's basically the reason that Bitcoin can scale by SPV technology that many people miss.
So by following the whole proof of work chain, you mean they'll go and look at all the EXOs and make sure that there's no double spending? Is that what it means? What is that?
No, I just mean following this,
The hash.
just the block headers, the chain of block headers.
Good question.
Yeah.
What if you have a block reorder?
Then you'll have a reorg in your SPV wallet the same way you'll have in the client. So you could have, I'll show that pointer. So maybe like there's another, instead of this block here, there's another competing block that's built above it, built on top of this one. and eventually this parallel branch becomes longer, then your client is going to drop these 2 blocks and it's going to accept this longer chain up here. So whether you're running a full node like Bitcoin Unlimited or an SPV wallet, the same mechanism happens. So they basically have the same security in terms of, you know, following that proof of work chain from the miners.
I missed the part where it verified those previous, that the transactions were not finished.
Yeah, so that happened.
I get the puzzle, but I don't see how it relates to looking through the history and making sure that.
Right, so I'm focusing more on the perspective from SPV wallet, so I'm not telling you all the information you need to know, but that was happening in this step here. So when remember, the miner, we're imagining how we're filling in this block header to mine. So what we did is we gathered up all the transactions that we wanted to confirm, and in gathering them up, we had to make sure they were valid and not double spent. So once we're sure about that, then we take this digital fingerprint called the root hash and we stick it here. But the critical point though is once you've calculated your root hash from your collection of transactions, you don't need the transactions anymore. You can mine just based on the block header information. And that's why SPV works, because in order for a wallet to follow along, all they need is that chain of block headers. Okay, so like I was saying, so the critical thing to realize is that all those transactions sit outside of the chain, so it doesn't take a lot of information to follow along the proof of work chain by the miners. And to put some numbers to this, well, each block header is 80 bytes, and we're adding block headers at a rate of about once every 10 minutes. So in terms of memory consumption, that's 80 bytes times 144 blocks per day times 365 days per year. It works out to about 4 megabytes per year. That's like 1 cat picture's worth of data, right? It's nothing at all in the grand scheme of things. So that is how much information a user's wallet needs to follow along with the proof of work chain. In terms of bandwidth, it's even crazier. It works out to 1 bit per second your SPV wallet needs to follow along. That's not megabit or gigabit, that's literally 1 bit per second, which means that I could transmit the block headers by tapping in Morse code. Another way to look at it is in terms of SMS or text messages. A classic SMS message is limited to 160 bytes in size. So that means that 2 Bitcoin block headers could fit in a single text message. And what's really cool is like a $5 feature phone could follow along the proof of work chain by the miners just by receiving 1 text every 20 minutes. And what's really cool is there's actually 4 billion people in the world. 1/2 of Earth's population has a feature phone that's SMS enabled. So basically they already have the hardware and the data link to follow along with Bitcoin's proof of work chain. Okay, so the answer to the question is if there's any scaling challenges here is no. Okay, so the next thing we had to learn was how does a Bitcoin owner transfer her coin? This is described in section 2 of the white paper, and I'm going to read the 3 sentences here. We define an electronic coin as a chain of digital signatures. Each owner transfers the coin to the next by digitally signing a hash of the previous transaction and the public key of the next owner and adding these to the end of the chain. A payee can verify the signatures to verify the chain of ownership. And Satoshi included this figure to help make sense of the paragraph above it. So we look at this figure more closely on this slide. And it's a little bit confusing because there's a lot of stuff going on, so we're going to simplify it. We're going to get rid of those next 2 transactions, and we're going to imagine that this is the last transaction that's been added on to our coin, and instead of we're going to add some names to it, so we have Alice's pub key there and Zoe's signature. So if this is the last transaction that's been mined to the blockchain, who owns the coin at this point? Is it Alice or is it Zoe? Right, it's Alice. It's kind of a trick question. Everyone, your natural reaction is to say Zoe. Good. So if Alice wants to send that coin to Bob, what she does is she needs to ask Bob for his public key, and then she's going to hash the transaction that she received from Zoe, along with Bob's public key, pull out her private key, sign the hash, package the resulting signature and hash up in a transaction, and either broadcast that to the Bitcoin network or deliver it to Bob. If Bob then wants to transfer that coin to Carol, he just does the same thing again. So we've built up figure 1 from the Bitcoin white paper. Okay, so now that we know the mechanics of Bitcoin transactions, are there scaling challenges with respect to transacting? And we can answer that question by looking at a couple factors. So the average transaction size is 500 bytes. So Alice can give her coin to Bob by just giving him 500 bytes of information. So it's like receiving 3 SMS text messages. It's a trivial amount of information. And so that means that all 4 billion SMS users could easily send and receive a few transactions per day with their existing technology and the existing networks. So the answer again to whether there's scaling challenges is no. Okay, so the last thing we have to understand is the relationship between coin transfers and that proof of work chain built by the miners we discussed earlier. So question for you guys, if Alice can just give her signed transaction to Bob, and then Bob can just pass it on to Carol, why do we even need the miners? Like, yeah.
Well, those characters aren't technically double spending.
But,
Alice,
yeah.
Bob, and Carol.
Good. So we need the miners just to prevent double spending. But it's kind of weird to think about, though. If Alice and Bob and Carol, if they all trust each other, and the coin is just going hop to hop to hop, it doesn't actually matter. Like, it can only be a problem if one of them tries to attempt fraud. Right. But so that's the reason we need the miners. We need the miners to prevent any one participant in that chain of transaction from trying to spend the same coin twice. We need the miners to prevent that.
This is assuming Alice is sending Bob the same amount that Bob is sending Carol, right? Because they're signed with that particular
Yeah, so this,
amount of token.
so that would be a great topic for a different talk. But the way Bitcoin works is that you don't spend a balance. Like, your address doesn't have a balance. You actually spend whole coins. So in my example, I'm imagining that we're sending a whole Bitcoin. Maybe it's 1 Bitcoin, maybe it's 1.4 Bitcoins. It doesn't matter what the value is, but we're sending one whole unspent output from Alice, pass it on to Bob, pass it on to Carol. In reality, probably the balances aren't going to be perfect. So maybe Alice has 1 Bitcoin, she only wants to send 0.5 to Bob, but she can't write a transaction that sends 0.5 to Bob. She has to write a transaction that spends that whole 1 Bitcoin coin and creates 2 coins out of it. So you're always spending whole coins. It's just sometimes there's a change output. Okay, so here we are. So the reason we need the miners to prevent them from spending the same coin twice, to prevent fraud. Okay, so now we talked about how the miners, they organize the transactions they want to confirm, and they write the root hash and the block header, but we haven't talked about the mechanism for how they actually calculate that root hash. And that's the real magic of Satoshi's design, which allows Bitcoin to be highly scalable to billions of users. So the transactions are organized in a block in a really brilliant way. So this example, we're just going to pretend our block has 4 transactions in it. So that's TX0, TX1, TX2, TX3. So what the miner does is he hashes each of those transactions to get hash 0 through hash 3. Then what he does is he hashes the hashes into what's called a Merkle tree. So he takes hash 0, hash 1, hashes them together to get this hash 0, 1. He hashes 2 and 3 to get this hash 2, 3, and then he hashes these 2 things together to calculate the root hash. And the reason this is brilliant is it allows the miner to provide proof to Bob in a very compact way that that transaction that Bob received from Alice was actually confirmed in a valid block. So the way this works is the miner only has to pass Bob 2 pieces of information. So remember, Bob's SPV wallet is already following along the proof of work chain by the miner. So Bob's wallet already has all the block headers. And Bob already knows the transaction from Alice because Alice gave it to him. So all he needs are these 2 additional pieces of information, because watch what happens. So he has his transaction shown there in green. He hashes it. He can calculate hash 3. But since he knows hash 2 from the miner, he can also calculate hash 23. Since he knows hash 01 from the miner, he can also calculate the root hash. If that root hash matches the root hashes that's actually in the Bitcoin block header that they downloaded from someone else, then that's cryptographic proof that the transaction has been confirmed in the longest chain. So that's what Bitcoin's security model is all about, and to me, it's a really awesome design. Okay, so are there scaling challenges with respect to proving inclusion in the block using this Merkle branch technique? And if you look at this picture, it doesn't seem that impressive because, we only have 4 transactions here. So, really it wouldn't be that hard for Bob just to download all the transactions and calculate the whole Merkle tree himself. But you can imagine if we had 8 transactions, well, now we're going to add another layer to our Merkle tree. If there's 16 transactions, there's another layer to our Merkle tree. And the math works out very, very nicely. With 4 transactions per block, the miner must provide Bob with 2 pieces of information. Each piece of information is 32 bytes in size, so Bob needs 64 bytes of data to prove that his transaction was confirmed. With 8 bytes in a block, he needs 3 pieces of data, or 96 bytes. With 32 transactions in a block, it works like this. And if you scale up to 1,000 transactions per block, well, Bob still only needs 10 pieces of information, or 320 bytes from the miner. And 1,000 blocks, now we're talking 1 megabyte in size. If there's 1 million transactions in a block, it only requires 20 pieces of information, 640 bytes. Even 1 billion transactions in a block, the miner only has to deliver Bob 960 bytes of information. So I don't think we'll ever see 1 billion transactions in a block. That would be Bitcoin scaling more than anybody thinks right now. But the point is, SPV still works. This technique still scales to that many users and that many transactions. Okay, so the answer to the question posed is no, yes.
Does this work for multi-sig transactions or what these other?
Absolutely, it works for all transactions. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think that the hesitation to allow Bitcoin to scale with bigger and bigger blocks is because I think so many people didn't really understand how SPV works. Okay, so going on, bringing BCH to billions of SPV wallets. So question, is it easy for users' wallets to track the proof of work chain? I think we've established that yes, it is. It takes very little data for them to do so. Is it easy for users to send and receive transactions? Yes, again, the amount of data we're talking is less than a kilobyte, and they can transact directly with each other. It's totally peer-to-peer. So that gets a check mark as well. And lastly, is it easy for miners to prove to users that a transaction was confirmed in a block? And I think I've established it, regardless of how many transactions we begin seeing in blocks or how many users we have, it's never going to require more than maybe a kilobyte of information to prove to you that the transaction that you received was confirmed. Yes?
Except that the miner has to keep a lot of information.
The miner
and provide this as a service out of the goodness of their heart.
Yes, so let's talk about that in a bit. Okay, so that one gets a tick as well. Okay, so that basically ends the technical part of my talk. And I thought we could conclude by just brainstorming some ideas for ways to improve SPV wallets. So I have a big long list here. To me, the biggest thing is I think we need wallets with simpler interfaces. Like, to me, if I'm developing, I like to get right into the nitty gritty. I like to, be able to fine tune whatever I want. But if I'm just like Peter who's having a beer with friends at the bar, I don't want to think. I just want to pay, And so let's make things so simple that we don't have to think about it. You asked about miners providing that information. I think a really cool business idea would be not necessarily a mining node, but just like a non-mining node that provides information to SPV wallets as a business. So right now, there's so many people running nodes and the miners, they're not managing that many transactions, that most people running nodes are happy to deliver SPV proofs for free. They don't charge for it. But if we imagine a future where there's 4 billion people all running these SPV wallets, they're making a lot of demands on the miners. Maybe they won't want to provide it. So I think that's a nice business opportunity, maybe 5 years down the road, should Bitcoin continue to grow, for these specialized nodes to just get really efficient at digging up those proofs and providing them to the wallets. Yes?
I think they might be incentivized to provide it because then whoever has SPV is going to want to create transactions which will create fees that then maybe well, I guess that's only minors, not full nodes.
That's actually a cool idea. Because right now we broadcast transactions to the entire network, but maybe there'll be deals in the future where the miners provide you SPV proofs for free if you submit your transactions to them or something, so they get the mining fee. I have no idea how it's going to turn out, but I think there's lots of opportunities here. Yes.
For point 3, has there been any consideration for an address name service or DNS?
Yeah, so people have talked about using Namecoin possibly for that, or some other solutions, but nothing's really matured to the point where it's workable. So I think the closest is probably some work that BitPay has done implementing BIP70, but a lot of people don't like it because it involves those X509 certificates, and it's it works for bigger companies to associate a name with some certificate, but it's a bit harder for users to do that. But I think if there was some robust way so that I can pay Tarek as opposed to QQQ8357, that's going to take Bitcoin, to the next level in usability. And mistakes happen. Like in Bitcoin Unlimited, we're always receiving payments, we're always making payments, and it's hard to get the addresses right all the time. It's surprisingly common. Yes.
I heard that with things like SegWit, they'll be able to do more experimental things without as much risk to the network. If there's any, how is Bitcoin Cash going to do more experimental things? I don't know if you know about that. Is that not true?
I don't really, personally, I wouldn't say that's true. I think Bitcoin Cash is probably the more experimental of the two blockchains. For instance, when Satoshi initially created Bitcoin, he had a very full suite of opcodes that you could construct transactions with. So right now we basically use multi-sig and we use pay to pubkey hash. But there's a crazy scripting language built into Bitcoin, and a lot of those opcodes were disabled before Satoshi released it because he was worried about different attacks or different vulnerabilities. So in the hard fork coming up in May, Bitcoin Cash will be slowly reintroducing some of those opcodes to provide more depth to the programming language behind Bitcoin. So I would argue that probably Bitcoin Cash is going to have more flexibility that way. Yeah.
So everything that you've described, would you say is the initial vision of Satoshi? And did you get it all from the white paper, more or less?
I think a lot comes from the white paper, but I think to really convince yourself, you need to go through Satoshi's different threads on Bitcoin Talk, some of the emails chains he's had with Mike Hearn in particular. And to me, it was, I was actually surprised when the block size war broke out, and I guess it was 2014 and later, went more earnestly in 2015, that there was such a backlash towards bigger blocks because, the reading I had done up to that point and the people I was talking to, it seemed like, yeah, it was like a no-brainer. That was the design. Bitcoin was going to continue scale with bigger blocks, and users would run light clients. So I'm totally convinced that that's what Satoshi had planned, because the design just it's designed for that. Yes.
I was wondering if you could clarify what's the upside to having the small blocks and why were people opposed to it?
The upside to having small blocks is it becomes easier for users to verify not only their transactions, but everybody else's transactions in the world too. So to me, I don't see the value in that because you already know, what you care about is your transaction. And with SPV, you can already verify that your transaction is true, is valid. So I feel that there were people that felt that if less and less users are verifying all the world's transactions too, that maybe like the miners or the big companies that are running nodes could like eventually start breaking the rules if there weren't as many watchdogs making sure they were enforcing the rules. But to me, that seemed like a silly argument because there's always going to be tons of honest people auditing the blockchain. Like Bitcoin Unlimited runs several nodes. All the universities that have cryptocurrency programs are running nodes. Tons of companies, like BitPay basically has to run a node for zero comp for liability. So I don't think the thing they were worried about it was ever reasonable, but that was a concern.
So if it wasn't reasonable and it wasn't real, do you think there's another motive maybe for it? I mean, I've heard it, like it sounds like you're saying that the motivation for resisting moving towards big blocks isn't well-founded or it doesn't seem rational to you, right?
It doesn't seem rational to me.
And if that's the case, because I mean, I've heard theories floated, for example, that it was an unconscious agreement to sort of dilute Bitcoin, that it was a way to just essentially do like a stock split where everybody holding Bitcoin would be able to double their holding of different chains, that it was just an excuse to kind of like,
Yeah.
I mean, is there?
I mean, there's lots of crazy theories. Like, I'm not saying, I don't mean to say your theory is crazy, because I think whatever it is crazy. I don't know what the answer is. Like, there's that theory. There's a theory that, Blockstream wanted to, move all these transaction fees into side chains and Lightning Network. So by limiting the throughput on the main network, they would push business to their custom products. There's other theories that, the block size limit was being kept down because the banks didn't want Bitcoin to ruin their businesses. There's all sorts of, I say crazy because what I mean is unproven theories. I don't know what the right answer is. But the bottom line to me is it never made sense to restrict the block size, especially not to 1 megabyte. Yeah.
What do you think about the risk of centralization in Bitcoin versus Bitcoin Cash? Do you think they're both equally at risk of centralization, or do you think one is more?
Well, centralization is one of those words that everyone kind of gets excited about, but nobody can really properly define. So the way I look at centralization, I would say that Bitcoin Core, BTC, has the bigger centralization problem because it's so centralized around the Bitcoin Core client software itself. So they really have, they have a really strong group of developers, a very small clique that basically make the rules, and they view themselves as defenders of decentralization. But kind of ironically, in order for them to have that power, they need to be in central control of the protocol. So sure, they can, maybe do some things to keep resources to run nodes down and some other helpful things, but I think it gives them a lot of power and creates centralization there. So I would say that, in my opinion, Bitcoin Cash is design and political ideology is more in line with decentralization than BTC is.
How much?
Sorry, I think you're next.
Yeah, there's a lot of transactions per second, like let's say 1 million transactions per second. Are the miners going to download every single transaction, and are they going to verify every single transaction? Because that takes time and stuff, right?
Right. So remember when I showed the picture of the block headers and I had all those transactions, and then someone calculated the Merkle route? So somebody needs to verify all the transactions in order to create that Merkle route. But if you're a miner running from some node at your home in San Francisco, you don't actually have to verify all the transactions. You could work with a mining pool, and then you're just given the block header, and then you just hash away on that. So you have to trust that the block header was constructed properly, but you can still participate in mining. But I think the answer is, in general, that if Bitcoin scales in the fashion that I'm proposing here, that professional Bitcoin miners will be bigger companies, and they'll have really fast interconnections and powerful servers to receive all the transactions really quickly and to validate them very fast as well.
In that case, then the miners become like probably potentially censor or something and just not include some transactions and provide the other miners in that pool with whatever hash they want, right?
Well, so this kind of brings up your question about some of the risks of bigger blocks. So I said there's no risk to users being able to follow along, but yes, there is a risk to like small miners being pushed out. But to me, I don't see that as an issue, because what matters for censorship resistance is just that at least 51% of the network is honest. So if one miner wants to censor your transaction, as long as one of the other miners will accept it, it's going to make it into the chain. But that's true whether we have 1 megabyte blocks or whether we have 1 gigabyte blocks. So all that matters, as long as the majority is honest, then there's no problem. So the question is the majority less likely to be honest if blocks are bigger? To me, that doesn't seem like there'd be a correlation there.
And how many people are, like, just rough idea in the Bitcoin Cash, like, developer community? Like, you have like 3 clients. How many do you have in your, like, the core people?
Bitcoin Unlimited, it probably has the largest group of developers. I think we have about 5 or 6 full-time developers, and then, it's open source, so a lot of people contribute on a part-time basis. So, our Slack channel has, several hundred people, and there's probably, 20 or 30 people that are actually writing code at any given, point in time. Bitcoin ABC, there's 2 developers that are full-time, and I think some other part-time developers as well. And Bitcoin XT, I believe, has 2 full-time developers as well. So there's not really that many developers, and for good reason, because the work has to be done on like SPV wallets and improving the user experience and all the stuff that's really or largely orthogonal to the protocol development itself. Yes.
If a government or like a powerful person wanted to shut down Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash, which one do you think would be like, easier to, or harder to shut down? What's like the attack surface between that? What's the worst they could do?
I mean, I think that, where we are in Bitcoin right now, I think if a government really wanted to shut it down, it could. Because I think there's just not enough users. I think it could shut down BTC or BCH. If the US government made Bitcoin illegal, I think that would probably kill it. But I think since Senate hearings in 2030, it's pretty clear that's not going to happen. So I think regulation-wise, we're pretty safe. So I think the best thing we can do to make it less likely for the governments to shut down Bitcoin is to grow as quickly as possible. The more people that are excited about Bitcoin, the more people whose wealth depends on Bitcoin, the more people that are using Bitcoin, the more backlash you're going to have against governments if they try to shut it down. Yes?
Just to kind of extend that question, I've discussed with several people the idea that the recent increase in like aggressive attempts to destroy net neutrality and Title II, which are now moving.
I'm sorry, I missed that word. The aggressive attempts to.
Aggressive attempts to destroy net neutrality, to delete
yeah.
Title II.
Yes.
Is actually being driven by an alignment of the financial services industry and the regulatory industry and a bunch of industries simultaneously, including the tech industry here in the Bay Area, that are seeing like distributed consensus as a threat to all these business models simultaneously, and that undermining neutrality and enabling the ISPs to get low-level control of the internet is the introduction to a sort of hardware-level interference with these protocols. Do you see that as being possible, or do you think that there'll always be a way around low-level IPv6-based packet control of all data communications between these miners?
I'm probably not the best person to ask that. I know, 2 people whose opinion I really respect, Emin Gunsir and Chris Pacia. They both have different views on net neutrality. Emin Gunsir, thinks we should keep it and it's really critical, where I think Chris had the opposite view. I might not be Chris, so if anyone's watching, don't quote me on that. But one of the developers like that, he was saying that, no, getting rid of net neutrality is a great thing for X, Y, and Z. I haven't researched enough to really have an answer. But I think I do have an answer on the question of, let's say that the ISPs became really nasty and started making it difficult. I don't think that could ever really destroy the Bitcoin network, because there's so many ways around it. There's so many ways to disguise the data. There's so many other mediums for exchanging the data that I think it would always find a way to work out. Like there's nodes in satellites now, right? So
Those are what?
there's nodes in satellites now.
There's nodes in satellites, but the airspace between us and the satellites is also governed by the FCC. The electromagnetic airspace is bid, bought, and sold by these companies.
Yeah.
And there's vans, in fact, driving around it. What's enforced?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like I think it's interesting to talk about. It's not something I'm really worried about because I think the amount of control the governments would have to really squash Bitcoin, it would be too hard. I think the better way, if they really wanted to get rid of Bitcoin, would just be make it illegal.
So, and then just to follow on that, because I've also discussed the possibility of making malicious minor actors that pretend to be a valid actor on the network and just send confusing traffics and do things like dynamically monitor other listening nodes and overwrite bind entries in the routers to try to confuse packets going between the miners. Have you discussed any of those options? Or?
Well, I mean, Bitcoin is very hostile at the network level. Like when the block size limit war was happening and Bitcoin Unlimited was coming out with Exton, for instance, like there were various groups that were going through our source code and trying to find weaknesses, and there were attacks that they took out like several of our nodes through all this like really advanced mechanisms. So I think the reality is it is an adversarial environment, and it will continue to be an adversarial environment. But I think that's a good thing because we can fix the weaknesses and grow stronger as a network as a whole. And on that note, that's why, in my opinion, it's so important that we have genetic diversity in terms of node implementations. Bitcoin Cash has unlimited, ABC, XD, I'd love to have even more. I'd like to have 10 dominant implementations that were all slightly different in their source code. So one weakness that one node might have, the other nodes aren't affected by it. So it would be very hard for a determined attacker to kill 80% of the network. Maybe they could take out 10%, but it would be very difficult to take out 80%. I'd like to get to that point. Yes.
Where do you see the Bitcoin Cash community around bulletproofs and different types of privacy implementations?
I haven't researched bulletproof, so I don't think I gave you a good answer. In terms of privacy, what were you thinking about?
Yeah, so just where do you see, at least that's how the community working on privacy features?
I think the culture within Bitcoin Cash is similar to within BTC. I think we value privacy. I think that is a kind of a core tenet of Bitcoin, and we would like to do whatever is possible to improve privacy. But I think changing to something like Zcash or what Monero does, I don't think you're ever going to get such a drastic change in Bitcoin Cash. But I think there's still a lot simpler stuff that we can do that can improve privacy. For instance, my point 2 here, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Like when I was explaining how payments work, how Alice can sign the transaction and she can just give it to Bob. She doesn't have to use the relay network to send it. That would improve privacy right there, because now Bob doesn't have to be pinging all these nodes saying, do you have transactions? Have you seen any transactions to my addresses? So he keeps that information to himself, and it's purely peer-to-peer. In fact, let's talk a little bit about point 2 here, because I think it's probably the second lowest hanging fruit that we could do to really improve SPV wallets. Because if you think about how the protocol works right now that most wallets use is, say I want to send you $100 in Bitcoin, right? So let's say you have a Bitcoin Cash wallet, and I have a Bitcoin Cash wallet. Probably you're going to show me a QR code. I'm going to scan it, and I'm going to enter the amount, then I press send. But how that transaction actually gets to you is my wallet sends it up into the internet. It gets relayed over, all across the world to all the different nodes and miners. And then your wallet, meanwhile, is pinging other nodes, being like, have you seen any transactions at this address? Have you seen any at this address? And eventually, oh, yes, one comes in, and then your wallet downloads it. But it's kind of crazy because we're right beside each other. Really, I should just be, clicking my phone against yours, and I pass a signed transaction directly to you, and then it's instant. And then you can submit it to the network to be mined a little bit later. But there's less privacy data.
How many hops could that go on before you need to broadcast all of the following transactions? Like, could Alice then direct, transfer it to someone, a third party again, and then could that third party then relay the couple hops up to the network later on and have it get into a block?
Yeah, so as long as they're, so if Alice sends it to Bob, then Bob sends it to Carol, then Carol sends it to Dave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Dave won't be able to confirm the transaction he received from Carol until all the previous transactions are confirmed. But that chain can build really long. And
Trust everybody.
yeah. But the chain can basically become arbitrarily long, and as long as it eventually gets broadcast, it'll confirm.
And it will account for all unspent.
Yeah, so you can have very long chains of unspent outputs. Like some wallets don't allow you to spend unspent outputs. They don't allow you to spend it until it's confirmed, but the protocol itself allows for that. I think there's some limit, like so mine, let's say I have a full node, and Alice sends a transaction to Bob. I receive that. Then Bob sends it to Carol. Then Carol sends it to Dave. So my node will keep allowing those in until I think it gets to, I think it's around 27 transactions that's the max chaining. And then my node will start rejecting it. It says too long mempool chain. So that was something we came up with when we were doing the gigablock tests, because we were making 2,000 transactions per second. So we ended up at times with really long chains of unspent outputs. So you
guys been doing testing length of unchained unspent? Like you guys been pushing that to the max?
Well, it was kind of accidental. It was it was just because we were pushing so many transactions onto the network per second that there ended up being a lot of chaining because maybe a lock doesn't come for 30 minutes, but in that 30 minutes you've pushed several 100,000 transactions. Then you have a lot of chaining.
And so that's not a consensus rule.
No, that's just a like an is standard rule or a per node rule. So you can just. In fact, I think that's just in the Bitcoin comp file, so I don't even think you need to recompile or anything. You can just.
So we can treat Bitcoin like cash. I mean, that's when it becomes cash because then we're just spending. I mean, we were trying to do that in our company, like I told you, Satoshi Vision, essentially spend the unspent.
Yeah.
So you're saying that you guys essentially were able to spend large amounts of unspent.
Yeah, Bitcoin, it already works like that. Right. It's just a lot of wallets don't actually allow you to take advantage of that.
Right.
But no, like if you're playing with a low-level protocol, you can create transactions from unspent, and they'll all confirm. There's a small proviso there. There are still some sources of third-party malleability in Bitcoin Cash. So this is kind of the weakness, and I think we can fix it in Bitcoin Cash. But let me tell you what it is. So if Alice pays Bob, Bob pays Carol, Carol pays Dave, and then Alice's transaction eventually gets broadcast. And then some malicious third party exploits one of those malleability weaknesses. And then if the mall transaction confirms, then that whole chain becomes invalid. Yeah, so that's a bad thing. We basically never see malleability attacks anymore. It only really happened around Mt. Gox, and most of the big malleability weaknesses are fixed, but there still are some that exist, and we'd like to get rid of them completely.
Okay, but SegWit was a solution for malleability. We don't have a full Bitcoin Cash solution for malleability yet. You can detect malleability attacks that we don't.
Yeah, and we've gotten rid of several sources of malleability, but there are still some remaining sources. And so a SegWit transaction itself is unmalleable,
Right.
but a non-SegWit transaction has the same weaknesses to malleability as a Bitcoin Cash transaction. So both chains have malleability.
So
Yeah.
I feel like what you're describing with the payment directly in number 2
Yeah.
is possible among friends or trusted parties, but it's not suitable for like a store with customers who are strangers.
Well, it kind of gets to the debate about how safe unconfirmed transactions are. So if
But you're talking about a transaction, it's not just unconfirmed, it hasn't even been checked.
Okay, so let's kind of work through this. So if you're the coffee shop and I'm buying a cup of coffee from you, it would be really cool if I could pay you by just sending the transaction directly to you. I don't want to go through the whole network because it leaks privacy and all the other problems that we talked about. But if you're the coffee shop owner, you probably have internet anyways, right? So your best interest is just to broadcast that as soon as possible so that I can't try some double spend or malleability attack against that. But maybe before I give you that transaction, maybe I got the transaction from Alice and it's still unconfirmed. So this is the kind of thing that, one of the reasons why a lot of the wallets won't allow these long chains to build up, because now you kind of got to worry about the person that I gave it to acting funny as well. So the risk increases the longer that chain of unspent transactions builds up. So yes, I think it's useful in many cases, but yeah, the trust model is different for sure.
I think we're nearly out of time. Any last questions? Make it good. That'd be really good.
What makes you excited about the future of Bitcoin Cash? You're going to see it in like 10 years or something?
Well, to me, it's just, before August 1st, it was just this vicious debate in the Bitcoin community. There was the big blockers and the small blockers, and they were both at each other's throats. Since the split happened, things have really calmed down, and I feel that, the core guys are working on Lightning Network, the big block guys are working on growing Bitcoin Cash, and, I can kind of wish them well, they can wish me well, and let's see what solution ends up working the best long-term. I think the answer will be big blocks and SPV wallets.
Is there room for more than one?
I don't know. In 10 years from now, imagine that cryptocurrency catches on. Do you think there'll be one dominant currency, or do you think there'll be several? I think there'll be one.
Really good question. It's a quick question. Is it good? Yeah.
I think there'll be one, but I'm not.
Peter, you want one more?
Sure,
Is
yes.
there an SPV wallet that works that you recommend today?
Yeah, my favorite SPV wallet is Bread Wallet,
Okay.
and it's available for iOS, and I think they have an Android version now too.
All right, thanks.
And with that, thank you, Peter.